Billionaire insulted her in front of everyone. A nanny's heartbreaking journey. Hey, beautiful souls. Welcome, truly welcome, to Alcot Stories. I'm your storyteller, Alcot Brian, and I'm so deeply honored to have you here, whether you're returning like a dear friend or stepping into this world for the very first time. Before we begin, let me offer a little prayer, just for you. May the story you hear today touch the corners of your heart that needed to feel seen. May your spirit feel lighter by the end of it, your soul warmed like sunlight after the storm. And may you never forget that your story matters too, because every scar has a voice, and every tear is part of your strength. Now, I have one small request, and I say this not as a host, but as someone who believes in the power of words. Don't skip this story. Don't leave halfway. Because by the time the last line is spoken, you won't just have watched this story. You'll have lived it. And I promise you'll never regret it. So, before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching me from? I want to know the hearts and homes this story is reaching. Because stories are how we find each other, no matter how far apart we are. Now, breathe in, let go of the world for a while, and let's begin. The mansion stood like an ivory fortress, the epitome of wealth and power. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers that seemed to reflect every color imaginable, casting their glow over the elegantly dressed guests who were mingling with the air of exclusivity only the rich could afford. Grayson Blackwood, the 32-year-old billionaire, stood at the center of it all, his chiseled features and perfectly tailored suit making him the object of admiration. His reputation was one of ruthlessness, a man who never hesitated to trample over others to get what he wanted. He was a man who valued power, money, and the beauty of the world in the way he defined it. Pure, flawless, white. He often believed that wealth was the answer to every problem, that it could control people and shape the world in his vision. He only associated with people who fit his ideal, and when it came to the care of his daughter, Savannah, it was no different. His obsession with maintaining an image of superiority had led him to hire a nanny who ticked all the boxes, but not in the way he expected. Zara, a kind-hearted woman of African descent, was the one person who had been there for Savannah when no one else could. Zara was more than a nanny. She had become a mother figure to Savannah in every sense of the word. Despite her gentle nature, Zara's presence in the Blackwood household was something Grayson could never quite accept, his prejudice too ingrained to see the love she provided for his daughter. Today was supposed to be a day of celebration, the grand birthday of his beloved daughter, Savannah. The room buzzed with the laughter of children and the clinking of glasses as Grayson stood proudly at the center of the festivities, his smile a mask for the emotions he refused to show. His eyes were cold, as always, his gaze scanning the room like a predator, ensuring that everything remained perfect, just the way he wanted it. Savannah, dressed in a stunning dress of pure white lace, her innocence shining through, beamed with joy as she eagerly awaited the moment to cut her birthday cake. The guests were in awe of her beauty, her youth, a symbol of Grayson's wealth and legacy. But in that sea of admiration, Zara stood at the edges, observing quietly, as she always did. Her job was simple: care for Savannah, ensure her happiness, and stay out of the way of Grayson's world. And for Zara, it was enough. To see Savannah smile, to hear her laugh, was all the reward she needed. But today would be different. Zara had no idea that the moment she stepped forward to embrace the love she shared with Savannah would change everything. As the moment finally arrived, Savannah clutched the knife tightly in her small hands and cut into the cake, the crowd clapping in delight. There was something magical about the way she held the knife, innocence and joy intertwined. After the first slice was made, Savannah looked up at Zara with her big, pleading eyes. "Mummy Zara, will you taste it with me?" she asked, her voice full of hope and sweetness. Zara's heart swelled with emotion at the simple request. She had always been the one to kiss Savannah's scraped knees, dry her tears, and reassure her in the way only a mother could. But the weight of those words, "Mommy Zara," sent a shockwave through her chest. It was more than just a request to taste the cake. It was a symbol of the bond they shared, one that Grayson could never comprehend. Zara knelt down, a warm smile forming on her lips, her heart racing with the love she had for this little girl who had become like her own daughter. She gently kissed Savannah's cheek and took the piece of cake, savoring the sweetness as tears of affection welled up in her eyes. But before she could fully enjoy the moment, she heard it. The cold, bitter voice of Grayson. His words cut through the air like a knife, shattering the peace that had just begun to settle. "How dare you!" Grayson's voice was a thunderclap in the silence of the room. All eyes turned toward him, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Zara froze. She had always known Grayson to be cold, calculating, and dismissive, but nothing could have prepared her for the venom in his voice. His eyes, usually so calculating and controlled, burned with fury as he advanced toward her, his steps echoing like death's footsteps. "How dare you kiss my daughter? How dare you touch that cake? You are nothing more than a servant in this house." His words were a dagger to Zara's heart, each syllable dripping with disdain. The entire room went silent. The guests, caught in the whirlwind of his anger, stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the scene unfold. Zara's eyes darted around the room, feeling the weight of 1,000 judgmental gazes pressing down on her. The man she had once trusted, the man she had hoped could someday see beyond his prejudices, was now exposing his true nature in front of everyone. His hatred, thick and suffocating, spilled out of him like a poison. Tears welled in Zara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him, not in front of them, but the injustice of it all, the humiliation, was too much to bear. Grayson's words, so cold, so final, made her question everything. Why had she ever believed that she could be a part of this world? Why had she ever allowed herself to hope that, despite the color of her skin, she could be accepted by this family, by him? She felt the sting of every word, as if they were cutting through her very soul. "You are nothing more than a servant," he had said. But to her, she had never been just a servant. She had been a protector, a caretaker, a woman who had offered her heart and soul to the child he called his own. Yet it meant nothing to him. The man she had once believed capable of love, of empathy, now stood before her, a cold, empty shell of arrogance and hate. Her breath hitched, and before she could say a word, before she could defend herself, Grayson pushed past her and sent the cake flying, his rage exploding in front of the guests. The room gasped, and Zara recoiled, her hands shaking. She wanted to say something, to scream, to fight back, but the words died on her lips. Instead, she felt the crushing weight of his hate pressing down on her chest. Without a word, without a single glance at her, Grayson turned and walked away. leaving Zara standing alone in the midst of the shattered cake and broken dreams. The tears that had been threatening to spill over for so long finally began to fall. She couldn't stop them, couldn't hold back the flood of emotion that poured from her eyes. She had been broken, not just by his words, but by the realization that she would never be more than what he saw her as. A black woman who could never be a part of his world. The room was silent, but the silence was deafening. All Zara wanted was to escape, to run far away from this place that had once felt like home, but now felt like a prison. She turned and fled, running to the private room she had often retreated to when the world outside had become too much to bear. Inside the room, she collapsed onto the floor, her sobs racking her body. Why had I been born for this? The thought echoed in her mind, the pain so deep it was almost suffocating. She could feel the weight of centuries of racism, of hatred, pressing down on her. She could feel the sting of every slur, every cruel word, every act of injustice she had ever endured. Why was I born to be hated for something I cannot change? She thought. Why was I born to always be an outsider in a world that will never accept me? And yet, amid the pain, amid the humiliation, a flicker of something more powerful than grief began to rise. Resilience. She would not let him define her. She would not let this man, this world, break her. She would fight. The door slammed behind her with a resounding thud, shutting out the cold, cruel world that had just crushed her spirit. Zara sank to the floor of the small, dimly lit room, her body trembling, her breath shallow. The weight of the humiliation felt as though it had shattered her into pieces, each fragment a reminder of her place in Grayson Blackwood's world. She had never been anything more than a servant, an invisible fixture in the mansion where her heart had bled for the little girl who had given her love in return. But now, in the wake of his angry outburst, she knew she would never be able to look at that house the same way again. Not that it had ever truly been hers. She had always been on the outside, always the other, always the one who was never truly accepted. No matter how much love she poured into Savannah, the walls of the room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the weight of her emotions. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that the tears still flowed freely. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to keep it together in the face of adversity. But this was too much. The sting of Grayson's words still echoed in her ears, louder than anything she had ever heard before. "How dare you kiss my daughter? How dare you touch the cake with your dirty hands?" It was as though those words had carved deep scars into her soul, leaving marks that would never fade. Her mind raced, replaying the moment over and over again, each time a little more painful, each time the wound a little deeper. Why had she allowed herself to believe that she could be something more in his life? Why had she ever thought that she could be seen as a person, as a mother figure to Savannah? She had always known the world she lived in, the world where her skin color was a mark of shame, a reason for others to look down on her, to think less of her. But to be treated this way by Grayson, the man she had given so much of herself to, was more than she could bear. He was supposed to be different. He was supposed to see beyond the color of her skin. She had hoped, for a brief moment, that maybe there was a chance for them to build something resembling respect, something more than the broken, transactional relationship that had existed between them. But now, in the silence of the room, she knew that was a naive fantasy. His cruelty had shattered her illusions, leaving her raw and exposed. Zara's mind wandered back to the day she had first entered the Blackwood household. She had been so full of hope, eager to take on the responsibility of caring for the child whose mother had passed away far too soon. Savannah had been just a baby then, so fragile and small, her innocent face full of promise. Zara had become her constant protector, the one person who could comfort her when she cried, the one person who could hold her when she was scared. Over the years, Zara had poured all of her love into the little girl. She had watched her grow, laughed at her silly jokes, and wiped away her tears when she felt misunderstood. Zara had never asked for anything in return. But the one thing she had always longed for was something that Grayson had never been willing to give: acknowledgement. Zara had always known that she would never truly belong in this world. Not in the way Grayson had built it, not with the color of her skin. And yet, she had kept trying, kept believing that if she just gave enough love, just showed enough care, he would see her. But it was clear now that her hope had been misplaced. She was nothing to him, just a tool to be used, a servant to be dismissed at will. The anger, the hurt, and the disbelief bubbled inside her, mixing with the overwhelming sadness that had taken over her heart. It wasn't just his words, it was the realization that she would always be on the outside looking in, that no matter how much she cared, how much she loved, she would never truly be accepted. Grayson would never see her as more than the help. She had always known that people like him didn't see people like her, but the depth of the pain was something she hadn't been prepared for. She had expected his coldness, yes, but she hadn't expected him to lash out so violently, so openly. His words had been like daggers, and though her mind screamed at her to rise above it, to ignore the cruelty and move on, her heart refused to listen. It ached too much. She wanted to scream, to lash out at him, to show him just how wrong he was. But she couldn't. She knew that even if she screamed, it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't change the fact that he would never understand. It wouldn't change the fact that his hate was so deeply rooted in him. It was like a poison running through his veins. Sitting in the corner of the room, clutching her knees to her chest, Zara's thoughts drifted to Savannah. The little girl's innocent request had been so pure, so full of love. Zara could still feel the warmth of her embrace, the sweetness of her kiss on Zara's cheek. It had been a fleeting moment, a small moment of tenderness in a world that had been nothing but cold. Zara had wanted to stay in that moment forever, to hold on to the love Savannah had so freely given her. But now, that moment felt like a distant memory, swallowed up by Grayson's cruelty. She could still hear the words Savannah had said to her, "Mommy Zara, will you taste it with me?" It had been such a simple, sweet request, one that had made Zara's heart swell with joy. But now that joy felt tainted, as if the love she had felt was somehow wrong, somehow not enough. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't break down. Not now. Not when Savannah still needed her. There had to be a way to move forward, to pick up the pieces of her shattered heart and continue on. But how? How could she face Grayson again after everything that had happened? How could she return to a place where she had been so humiliated, where she had been reduced to nothing more than a servant? The thought of returning to that house, to those walls, felt suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't bear the thought of facing Grayson again, of pretending that everything was fine when it was anything but. But as much as she wanted to run, to leave it all behind, Zara knew she couldn't. She couldn't abandon Savannah. The child needed her. Zara was all she had left. As much as Grayson's hatred had wounded her, she couldn't turn her back on the little girl who had given her a love so pure, so unconditional. Zara wiped her eyes again, trying to gather her thoughts, to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She had always been strong, always managed to persevere, and though this felt like the hardest challenge she had ever faced, she knew she had no choice but to push through it. She would endure. She had to. For Savannah, for the love that had kept her going all these years. But she couldn't pretend that the pain would just disappear. It was there, deep in her chest, gnawing at her, reminding her of everything she had lost. The thought of Grayson's face, the cold, unfeeling expression he wore when he insulted her, kept replaying in her mind, fueling the fire of anger that she was doing her best to suppress. She knew that he was a man driven by pride and prejudice, a man whose wealth had shielded him from the realities of the world. But that didn't make the pain of his words any less real. It didn't make the betrayal any easier to bear. Zara knew that this was a turning point, not just in her relationship with Grayson, but in her own life. She could feel it in her bones. Something inside her had shifted, something that would no longer allow her to be the quiet, submissive woman who tolerated the cruelties of others. She was more than that, and no matter what happened next, she would not let him, or anyone, define her again. The night grew heavier around Zara as she sat in the small, dimly lit room, the silence suffocating, her thoughts a constant, chaotic storm. The anger, the hurt, and the humiliation from the afternoon's events still clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. She knew that Grayson had shattered something inside her, but she also knew that he had underestimated the strength that resided deep within her. It was a strength she had never had to call upon before, one that now surged within her like an untamed force, refusing to let her succumb to the weight of his cruelty. There was a burning desire in her, a fire that she hadn't known existed, pushing her to rise, to stand tall in the face of everything that had been thrown at her. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back. The deep, gut-wrenching pain she had felt earlier was slowly starting to dull, replaced by a quiet resolve. As she gazed out of the window, the night sky blanketing the world in its stillness, Zara knew that she could no longer allow herself to be a passive player in this game of wealth, power, and hatred that Grayson had crafted. He had crushed her once, with words, with insults, with a cruelty she hadn't expected from someone she had trusted. But she would not let him do it again. The thought of leaving, of walking away from the mansion, from the life she had built around Savannah, was tempting. So tempting, in fact, that for a moment she entertained the idea. But then she thought of Savannah, the little girl who had become her world. Savannah. Her heart clenched at the thought of abandoning her. How could she leave the only child who'd given her unconditional love? How could she walk away from the girl who had called her Mommy Zara, who had trusted her with her deepest fears, her dreams, and her laughter? Zara's entire being had been entwined with Savannah's joy, her struggles, her every emotion. She had promised herself that no matter what happened, she would be there for her. No amount of pain, no cruel words from Grayson could take that promise away. Zara wiped away the last of her tears and stood up, her body stiff from sitting for so long. She felt a surge of energy course through her veins, a feeling of power she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just going to endure. She was going to transform. There was no way she could continue living in a world that saw her as less than human. But she wasn't going to let Grayson's hatred define her. She had always believed that love had the power to heal all wounds, that kindness could melt the hardest of hearts. But now, after today, she knew that love alone wasn't enough. She would need to change the way she thought about herself. No more would she allow herself to be the passive caretaker, the invisible background figure in Grayson's life. It was time for her to step into the light, to take control of her own destiny. But how? How could she change things? How could she make Grayson see her, truly see her, for who she was? She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. She couldn't keep letting him treat her like an afterthought. She couldn't keep letting him break her with his arrogance and his racist ideals. Zara wasn't going to let him strip away her dignity any longer. The following days felt like a blur, each one stretching on endlessly as Zara kept herself at a distance from Grayson, avoiding him as best as she could. But despite her attempts to keep to herself, there was an undeniable tension between them, an electric charge in the air that neither of them could ignore. Grayson, for all his wealth and power, didn't know what to make of Zara's sudden shift in demeanor. His eyes would often flicker toward her, as if searching for some kind of acknowledgement, a sign that everything was still normal, still under his control. But Zara didn't give him that. She didn't smile at him the way she used to. She didn't speak to him with the same kindness and submission she once had. Now, when their paths crossed, she held her head high, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. And in those brief moments of interaction, Grayson couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort, something he hadn't felt before. There was power in Zara now, a quiet strength that he couldn't quite understand. One evening, as Grayson prepared to leave for a meeting, he found himself standing in the hallway, watching as Zara passed by him, without a word. For the first time, he felt something stir inside him, a sense of guilt, something he had never felt before in his life. It was fleeting, a shadow of an emotion, but it was there. For the first time, he questioned whether he had gone too far, whether his actions had been more damaging than he could have ever imagined. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, and he shoved it aside, telling himself it didn't matter. His world had always been about control, about dominating those around him. And Zara was just another person who had to fit into that framework. But even as he told himself this, a small voice inside his head wondered if he had truly won. The more he watched Zara from a distance, the more he began to notice subtle changes in her. She was no longer the woman he could manipulate with a glance or a command. There was a quiet power in her silence, a defiance in the way she carried herself. Grayson found himself watching her more often, his thoughts betraying him, questioning his own actions. It unsettled him, something that never happened. He had always been in control of his world, always had the upper hand. But Zara was different, and for the first time he wasn't sure if he wanted to control her. He wasn't sure what he wanted at all. Zara, meanwhile, was becoming more and more attuned to the changes in Grayson. She saw the way his eyes would follow her, the way he seemed to hesitate before speaking to her. It was a subtle shift, but it didn't go unnoticed. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had a bit of power, power that didn't come from wealth or status, but from within herself. She had never realized just how much strength she had until now. The emotional scars from Grayson's cruel words were still there, of course, but they no longer defined her. She was defining herself, and as time passed, she began to recognize the growing tension between them, the unspoken words that hung heavy in the air whenever they were in the same room. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she couldn't deny that it was there. And then, one evening, after weeks of silence between them, Grayson found himself standing in front of her. It was late, and the house was quiet, save for the distant sound of Savannah's laughter echoing from upstairs. Grayson's gaze softened for just a moment as he looked at Zara, his eyes betraying the hardness they usually held. "Zara," he said quietly, his voice low. "Can we talk?" The words hung in the air, a rare vulnerability creeping into his tone. Zara's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed, her gaze steady. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to break the silence between them, but now that he had, she wasn't sure how to respond. In that moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Grayson's emotions were a whirlwind, but Zara's resolve remained unwavering. The battle between them was far from over, but it was only just beginning. Zara stood still in the quiet hallway, her back straight and her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected Grayson to approach her, hadn't expected him to speak to her after everything that had happened. For weeks, they had shared nothing but silence, and now, standing before him, it felt as though time had slowed. The weight of his gaze pressed down on her, heavy and unreadable, making her stomach tighten. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, feel the thrum of anticipation, of uncertainty. The man who had crushed her spirit with his words, who had made her feel less than human, was now standing in front of her, asking to talk. Zara wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it an apology? Was it an attempt to reassert control? His voice, soft yet laced with something she couldn't quite place, seemed genuine. But she had been burned before. She had learned the hard way that words, especially his words, meant very little. Yet there was something in his eyes now, something different. It was as if the mask he wore so carefully had slipped for just a moment, leaving behind a crack in the carefully constructed facade of a ruthless billionaire. For a brief second, she wondered if perhaps this was the beginning of a change, but she quickly shoved the thought aside. No matter what he said, she couldn't afford to let her guard down. "Zara," Grayson said again, his voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. The cold, authoritative edge that normally accompanied his tone was gone, replaced by something softer, something less certain. "I need to apologize." The words hit her like a slap to the face. She hadn't expected them, hadn't expected him to utter those words, let alone to say them with such an air of vulnerability. For a moment, she simply stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, had imagined what it would feel like when Grayson finally recognized the pain he had caused her. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure if it was enough. Was an apology enough to erase the years of hurt, of prejudice, of casual cruelty? Was it enough to undo the damage he had done? Zara's mind raced, her heart conflicted. She had always dreamed of a day like this, a day when Grayson would see her as a person, as someone worthy of respect. But now that it was happening, she realized that it wasn't as simple as just accepting his apology. He had done things that couldn't be taken back. He had humiliated her, belittled her, and made her question her very worth. How could a single apology undo all that? Still, she couldn't ignore the flicker of something inside her, a small, reluctant part of her that wanted to believe in him, to believe that he was capable of change. It was that same part of her that had loved Savannah, that had invested so much of her heart into a family that never truly saw her. But Zara had learned the hard way that love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap between them. She had given her all to this family. And where had it gotten her? It had gotten her nothing but pain and disappointment. "I don't need your apology, Grayson," Zara finally said, her voice steady, though every word felt like it was being torn from her chest. "What I need is for you to understand. Understand that your words hurt me, and they hurt me deeply. You made me feel less than nothing, like I was nothing more than an object, a servant to be discarded when you no longer had any use for me." Her voice wavered for a split second, but she steadied herself, her gaze unwavering. "I have always given you my best. I've given you my love, my care, and I've done it because I wanted to, but it's not enough anymore. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with being treated this way. Not by you. Not by anyone." Grayson stood there, his expression unreadable, but the silence between them spoke volumes. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with a mixture of guilt and something else, something Zara couldn't quite place. He had never seen her like this before, not like the woman who had always quietly accepted her place, who had always done her duty without question. This Zara was different. This Zara had strength, a strength he had never thought she possessed. For the first time, Grayson was confronted with the fact that she was not the meek, subservient woman he had so easily manipulated in the past. She was something more, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice lower now, as if the weight of her words had begun to sink in. I've always thought of you as a part of the family, but I didn't realize how much I had hurt you, and I'm sorry for that." The apology seemed almost too little, too late. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and tentative, as if Grayson himself wasn't sure he was worthy of her forgiveness. But Zara wasn't ready to forgive him. She wasn't sure she could. The wound was still too fresh, and the scars of his cruelty were too deep. Zara took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her emotions. "It's not just about the apology, Grayson," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's about how you've treated me. It's about the things you believe, the way you look at people like me, the way you've made me feel like I'm nothing more than a charity case, something to be discarded when you're done with me." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. You have to change, Grayson. You have to prove to me that you can see me for who I am, not just some hired help, not just the black nanny you so despise, but a person, a woman, a mother." Her words stung, but they were the truth he had never wanted to face, the truth that he had always been blind to, too wrapped up in his wealth and power to see beyond his own prejudice. Grayson had always thought of himself as someone above reproach, someone whose money and status could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, standing before Zara, he realized just how wrong he had been. For the first time in his life, Grayson felt small. It was a feeling he had never known, never wanted to know. But it was there, gnawing at him, making him question everything he had believed about himself. And as he stood there in silence, watching Zara, watching the woman who had given so much of herself to his family, he realized that he didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to lose what little connection they had left, no matter how fragile it seemed. Zara's heart raced as she looked at him, wondering if the man standing before her was truly capable of change, or if he was just playing the same game he had always played. But she couldn't let herself get lost in that uncertainty. She couldn't afford to hope again, only to be crushed. Not when it was her heart on the line. She had been crushed before, and she wouldn't let it happen again. "I don't know if I can believe you," she said softly, her voice steady, but filled with pain. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet." She took a step back, her heart heavy. "But what I do know is that I can't keep living like this. I need to figure out who I am, outside of this house, outside of your world. I need to find myself again." With that, Zara turned and walked away, leaving Grayson standing there, alone in the hallway. His heart twisted as he watched her leave, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within him. Something he didn't understand, but something that made him realize he might just lose the one person who had ever truly seen him for who he was. The days that followed were heavy, each one filled with the kind of silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. Zara kept herself occupied, burying herself in her work, her thoughts constantly drifting between the past and the present. She knew she couldn't go back to the way things were, couldn't allow herself to return to the same passive role she had once played. Yet, as she carried out her daily duties, taking care of Savannah with all the love and care she had always given, something inside her felt unsettled. The tension with Grayson hung over everything, an invisible force that seemed to shadow her every move. Grayson, for his part, had retreated into his own world, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. He had never been good at facing his own demons, at confronting the darkness that lingered just beneath the surface of his perfect controlled exterior. But now, standing on the precipice of a truth he had long ignored, he found himself unable to escape the feelings that swirled inside him. Zara's words echoed in his mind, each one like a strike against the walls he had so carefully built around himself. He had always believed that his wealth, his power, could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, he realized just how fragile that belief was. The life he had built on a foundation of control and privilege was crumbling, and for the first time, he didn't know how to stop it. He had tried to avoid her, tried to keep his distance, but the pull between them was undeniable. There was something about Zara, something that made him question everything he had ever known about himself. She had become a mirror, reflecting the parts of him he had never wanted to see, the parts of him he had always tried to bury. And yet, despite everything, despite the way he had treated her, she had stood her ground. She had refused to let him trample over her any longer. Grayson couldn't understand it. He had broken her. He had reduced her to tears, humiliated her in front of everyone, and yet she still had the strength to stand tall in front of him. One evening, after a long day spent in meetings, Grayson found himself in the quiet, empty house, his mind racing. He had tried to focus on work, on the million things that demanded his attention, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Zara. The quiet strength she had shown, the way she had refused to accept his apology without proof of change, had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. In the solitude of his office, he sat down at his desk, his hands pressing into his temples as if trying to hold back the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The flickering of the desk lamp seemed to mimic the chaos in his mind, casting shadows that danced across the walls. He had never been one to second-guess himself, to ponder the consequences of his actions. But now he couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, something fundamental. It wasn't just about Zara. It was about everything. His life, his beliefs, the walls he had built to keep people at a distance. And now Zara had broken through those walls in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. Grayson had always thought he knew who he was. He was the billionaire, the man who controlled everything around him, who held power over people's lives with a snap of his fingers. He had never had to answer to anyone. He had never had to care about how his actions affected others. But now, in the aftermath of his cruelty, he was forced to confront the reality that his power, his wealth, couldn't shield him from the damage he had done. He couldn't undo the hurt he had caused Zara. He couldn't erase the look of pain in her eyes when he had kicked the cake table over, when he had humiliated her in front of everyone. As the weight of his guilt pressed down on him, he found himself questioning everything. Was this the man he wanted to be? The man who reduced people to nothing more than their race, their status, their value in his eyes? Did he want to continue living in a world where power was the only thing that mattered? Where people like Zara were dismissed as less than human? He knew what he had to do. Zara had made it clear that words alone weren't enough. He had to prove himself. He had to show her that he was capable of change. But where could he even begin? The thought of approaching her again, of standing in front of her after everything he had done, terrified him. What if she didn't believe him? What if she saw him as nothing more than the arrogant, ruthless man he had always been? He had no idea how to make amends, how to take back the years of hurt he had caused her. In the days that followed, Grayson found himself in a constant internal struggle. Every interaction with Zara felt charged, filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged emotions. He wanted to reach out, to apologize again, but he knew that his previous attempts had been meaningless, without action. He had to do more than just speak the words. He had to prove to her that he had changed, that he was willing to fight for her, for them, for Savannah. But every time he saw Zara, every time he looked at her, he felt this overwhelming sense of regret, mixed with an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. He was the one who had wronged her, the one who had treated her like an object, and now he had no idea how to make it right. Zara, on the other hand, had reached a breaking point. The emotional weight of the past weeks had left her feeling hollow, drained. She had thrown herself into caring for Savannah, pouring all her love and energy into the little girl who had become her world. But it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness that had grown inside her. She couldn't ignore the painful truth anymore. She had been treated like an outsider in her own life. She had been forced to fight for her place in a family that had never truly accepted her. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Why had she allowed herself to be a pawn in Grayson's world for so long? Why had she allowed his prejudices to define her worth? But despite the anger, despite the overwhelming desire to leave, there was still a part of her that clung to hope. It was the same hope that had made her believe in Grayson in the first place. The hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. That he could change. That he could learn to see her for who she truly was. One afternoon, as Zara was taking a break from her duties, she found herself standing in the garden, looking out over the sprawling lawn. The wind carried the faint scent of flowers and fresh grass, and for a moment she closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel a sense of peace. But that peace was short-lived, shattered by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Grayson stood there, his presence heavy, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak immediately, and Zara didn't turn to face him. Instead, she let the silence stretch out between them, both of them trapped in their own worlds of uncertainty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Grayson spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Zara, I know I've hurt you. I know nothing I say can change what I've done. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be a better man, a better father, a better person. Please, just give me a chance." Zara didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she could trust him, if she could believe that he was truly capable of change. But there was something in his voice, something in the way he said her name, that made her wonder. Could he be different? Could he truly see her for who she was? "I don't know if I can believe you," Zara said, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had been carrying, "but I'm willing to try." For Savannah, Grayson's eyes softened, and for the first time, Zara saw the man beneath the mask. The days following their conversation were filled with a quiet unease, a fragile understanding that hovered between Zara and Grayson. There was a tacit agreement in the air that things couldn't remain as they had been. The walls that had once separated them, built over years of harsh words, unspoken grudges, and a deep-seated hatred, were starting to crumble. But the space left behind was raw and unfamiliar. It felt like walking on broken glass, unsure of where the next step would lead. Every time Grayson looked at Zara, his heart ached with regret, but also with a flicker of hope. He had never been this close to real vulnerability before. His wealth, his power, had always shielded him from truly facing the consequences of his actions. But now, with Zara, he was forced to confront everything: his own flaws, his prejudices, his miscalculations. Zara, for her part, had been caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The moment Grayson had spoken those words to her, admitting his mistakes, something inside her had shifted. It was a small shift, barely noticeable, but it was there. She had wanted to believe him. She had longed for him to understand the pain he had caused, and now that he was finally acknowledging it, a part of her wanted to soften. She wanted to reach out, to forgive him, and allow the wound to heal. But there was another part of her, an older, wiser part, that knew forgiveness was never simple, especially after years of feeling invisible, of being reduced to nothing more than a servant in a world she didn't belong to. She had learned to be strong, to protect herself, and this new vulnerability she was beginning to feel scared her. What if Grayson only saw her as a tool, a stepping stone to a better version of himself? What if his apology was just another way for him to maintain control? No matter how deeply he seemed to regret his past actions, Zara couldn't forget the years of hurt. She couldn't forget the way he had treated her as less than human, the way his words had cut her so deeply. Yet, despite the fear, there was something in her heart that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. Maybe Grayson could change. Maybe they could find a way to move forward together. Not as employer and employee, but as equals, as partners even. But that was a bridge too far for Zara to cross just yet. It was late one evening when the opportunity for change presented itself in an unexpected way. Grayson had been unusually quiet for the past few days, his eyes distant, his mind clearly preoccupied with something he couldn't quite articulate. Zara had sensed it, the restlessness in him, the unease that lingered just beneath his cool exterior. She had tried to ignore it, focusing on Savannah, on the small moments that still brought her joy. But tonight, something felt different. The air in the house was thick with unspoken words, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this night would be one of reckoning. Savannah had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day of playing. Zara had settled into the kitchen, preparing a small meal for herself. The quiet of the house wrapped around her, the only sound the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. As she moved around the kitchen, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She turned instinctively, knowing it was Grayson before she even saw him. He stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her, his posture tense. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though they were both waiting for something to break the silence, but neither knew who would speak first. Zara's breath caught in her chest. The distance between them seemed insurmountable, a chasm that neither of them had quite figured out how to cross. Finally, Grayson broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "Zara, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the way I've treated you, and I want you to know. I understand now. I see it. I see what I did to you, and I see how I've hurt you. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how much damage I was causing, but I do now. And I want to change that. I want to be different. For you. For Savannah." Zara didn't respond right away. She stood still, her hands frozen mid-motion as she looked at him. The man standing before her wasn't the Grayson she had once known, the ruthless billionaire who had used his wealth and power to control and dominate. This Grayson was something else entirely, vulnerable, honest, and strangely human. But was it enough? She put down the knife she had been using to chop the vegetables and took a deep breath. "Words are just words, Grayson," she said softly, her voice steady but illed with the weight of her experience. "I've heard them before. I've heard people say they've changed, that they see their mistakes, but they don't. They just keep repeating the same patterns. I can't afford to keep believing in empty promises." Grayson's face tightened at her words, but he didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't expect you to believe me right away, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. I don't want to keep living like this, like I'm the same man who hurt you. I don't want to be that man anymore." Zara swallowed hard. The honesty in his voice was undeniable, but the scars from the past still lingered like an open wound. Could she really open her heart again? Could she trust him not to break it once more? The answer wasn't easy, and she knew it wouldn't come overnight. But in this moment, standing before him, she saw the struggle in his eyes, the same struggle she had seen in herself for so long. "I'm not asking for anything, Grayson," Zara replied, her voice softer now. "I'm just saying that I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with being treated like I don't matter. I matter. I deserve more than that." Grayson nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between them. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to fix everything, to heal the damage he'd caused. But he was willing to try, and for the first time, he was beginning to understand the enormity of the task ahead. "I know, Zara. I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll prove it to you. I'll prove to you that I can be the man you deserve, and I'll prove it to Savannah, too. She needs me to be better, and I need to be better. For her. Zara felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of Savannah. The little girl had become more than just Grayson's daughter to her. She was a part of her heart. Zara had loved Savannah since the moment she had laid eyes on her, and seeing her grow up in an environment where she was loved, where she was cherished by both of her parents, was a dream Zara had never allowed herself to hope for. But could she allow herself to believe in that dream? "I'll need time, Grayson," Zara said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Time to heal. Time to trust you again." "I know," he replied softly. "And I'll give you all the time you need." Zara looked at him, her heart still heavy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something else. A faint stirring of hope, fragile and tentative, but present nonetheless. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way through the wreckage of their past and rebuild something stronger. But it wouldn't be easy. It would take patience, trust, and a commitment from both of them. The road ahead would be long, and the scars of the past would never fully disappear. But Zara had learned that sometimes the greatest strength came not from running away from the past, but from confronting it head-on. "I'm willing to try, Grayson," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "For Savannah, for me, but it's going to take more than just words." Grayson nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I know, and I'll show you. I'll show you every day that I mean it." As the silence settled between them, Grayson stepped back, giving her space. But the bond between them had shifted. It was still fragile, still in the early stages of something new, something fragile, but it was there. And in that moment, Zara felt the first flicker of hope in a long time. Maybe they could heal together. Maybe they could rebuild. Only time would tell. The fragile hope that had blossomed between Zara and Grayson after their conversation lingered in the air like a delicate thread. Thin, uncertain, but undeniably present. It was something neither of them dared to name, something too delicate to touch, for fear that it would break under the weight of the past they both carried. The next few days passed with a tentative quietness, filled with small but noticeable changes that neither could ignore. There was still a distance between them, but it wasn't the same cold, impenetrable barrier that had existed before. It was softer now, laced with vulnerability and unspoken promises. Every interaction, every glance, felt like a cautious step toward something unfamiliar, a fragile attempt to bridge the divide between them. Zara moved through the house with practiced grace, her heart still heavy from everything that had transpired, but she no longer felt invisible. There was an awareness in Grayson now, an effort that hadn't existed before, one that didn't go unnoticed. He was more present, quieter in his approach, his once commanding presence tempered with a kind of restraint that unsettled her just as much as it comforted her. It was strange how someone who had once seemed so untouchable, so unreachable, could suddenly feel so human. But that realization only made everything more complicated. She had given herself boundaries, firm walls to protect her heart from falling back into the dangerous rhythm of hope. But the way Grayson moved through his days now made those walls tremble. He wasn't the man who had belittled her in front of his guests anymore. He wasn't the cold, ruthless figure who had shattered her heart with careless words. No, this Grayson was different. He was trying, truly trying, to become the man he had promised to be. But Zara knew change wasn't simple, and forgiveness wasn't something that could be handed over easily, even if her heart wanted to believe in his efforts. Grayson, meanwhile, felt as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory with every step he took. The cold certainty that had once guided his actions was gone, replaced with a restless unease that gnawed at him constantly. Every time he saw Zara, caring for Savannah with her gentle patience, moving through the house with the quiet strength he had always overlooked, he felt that ache of regret twist deeper into his chest. He could see the hesitation in her eyes when she looked at him, the guarded way she held herself when he was near. He didn't blame her. He had given her every reason to shield her heart from him, but it didn't stop him from wishing he could erase every moment he had made her feel small, every moment he had used his power to tear her down. He had always believed he understood the world, its order, its expectations, its hierarchies. But Zara's presence had begun to unravel everything he thought he knew. She was no longer just a part of his household. She had become a mirror to his deepest flaws, his darkest prejudices, the ugly truths he had never wanted to acknowledge. And now, faced with the enormity of the damage he had caused, Grayson found himself determined to change, even if it meant tearing down the very walls he had spent years building. One evening, after Savannah had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its usual nighttime stillness, Grayson found himself standing outside Zara's door. He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air, unsure if he should knock or turn away. The weight of everything unsaid sat heavy on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't keep running from it. If he wanted to prove that he was serious about change, he had to take the first steps, no matter how uncomfortable or painful they might be. With a quiet breath, he knocked gently. For a moment, there was silence, so long that he almost considered walking away. But then the door opened slowly, revealing Zara, her expression guarded, yet calm. The sight of her stirred something in him, an ache of longing, of guilt, of things he didn't yet know how to put into words. "Is everything all right?" Zara asked, her voice soft but cautious. Grayson shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his emotions pressing hard against his chest. I wanted to talk, if that's okay." Zara hesitated, the familiar tension creeping into her body as she studied him. There was still so much between them, so much pain, so much unspoken. But something in his eyes made her step back, allowing him into the room. The space was modest, a reflection of Zara's quiet nature, warm but simple, filled with soft touches that spoke of a life lived with care despite the harshness of the world outside. Grayson glanced around, feeling oddly out of place in the room where Zara had built her own quiet sanctuary within his sprawling mansion. He had never considered how she might feel within these walls, how the house that represented his power might have felt like a cage to her. The thought made his throat tighten. "I know I've said this before," Grayson began, his voice rough with emotion, "but I need you to understand that I'm not the same man I was. I'm trying to change, Zara. Not just for you, but because I realize now how wrong I've been. About everything." He paused, searching for the right words. "I've lived my entire life believing that power and control were all that mattered, that people were only as valuable as what they could give me. But you've shown me how wrong I was." Zara listened, her heart pounding, unsure of what to say. She had heard apologies before, but this felt different, deeper, more genuine, as if Grayson was bearing a part of himself he had kept hidden from the world. "I know I can't erase what I've done," he continued, his voice softer now, But I want to make things right. I want to give you the respect you've always deserved. I want you to know that you matter more than I ever allowed myself to see." Zara's breath hitched at his words, emotions crashing over her like a wave she wasn't prepared for. There was a part of her that had longed to hear those words, that had dreamed of him recognizing her worth beyond her role, beyond the color of her skin. But the wounds of the past were still tender, and letting herself fully believe him felt terrifying. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "I don't know if I can just forget everything that's happened." "I'm not asking you to forget," Grayson said gently, his gaze unwavering. "I'm asking you to let me earn your forgiveness, however long that takes." For a long moment they stood in silence, two people bound by a complicated history, a tangle of emotions neither fully understood. But in that silence, something shifted, something fragile and new that neither of them dared to name, but both felt all the same. As the days passed, Grayson's actions began to speak louder than his words. He made small but meaningful changes, changes that didn't go unnoticed by Zara. He no longer barked orders or treated her as if she were invisible. He asked for her input when it came to Savannah, sought her advice on things he had once believed were beneath him, and slowly, without realizing it, began to dismantle the walls of prejudice he had built around himself for so long. Zara, cautious yet observant, watched the subtle transformation with guarded hope. She still held her heart close, unwilling to let herself fall into the illusion of change too quickly, but she couldn't deny that something in Grayson was different. His eyes no longer carried the same cold distance. They held a warmth she had never seen before, a softness that felt almost foreign. There were moments, brief and fleeting, where their eyes would meet across a room, and Zara would feel something stir inside her, something she had tried to bury beneath layers of pain and self-preservation. She didn't know what it meant yet, didn't know if it was the beginning of forgiveness or something else entirely. But she couldn't deny that the space between them was slowly shifting. One evening, as she tucked Savannah into bed, the little girl's sleepy voice broke through Zara's thoughts. "Will Daddy be happier now, Zara?" Savannah asked, her big eyes blinking up at her with innocent curiosity. Zara's heart tightened at the question. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because he smiles more when you're around now," Savannah whispered with a small yawn. "I think he misses you when you're not there." Zara's breath caught, the weight of Savannah's words settling deep in her chest. She kissed the little girl's forehead gently, her mind swirling with emotions she wasn't sure how to process. Maybe Grayson was changing. Maybe things were shifting in ways neither of them had expected. But whatever lay ahead, Zara knew she would move forward with caution, one unsteady step at a time, trusting her heart while protecting herself from the wounds of the past. And as she stood outside Savannah's room, her gaze meeting Grayson's in the hallway, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding that the road ahead would be difficult, but that they were no longer walking it alone. The hallway stretched long and quiet between them as their eyes locked in that silent exchange. Zara gripping the soft folds of her robe at her waist, Grayson standing still, a storm of things he couldn't say rising behind his carefully composed face. The silence wasn't heavy like before, not cold or sharp with unsaid hatred. It was cautious, charged with all the words they had buried, with the ache of things blooming too fast in soil still scarred from the past. Zara wanted to turn away first, to break the gaze, but something held her still. Some fragile thread she didn't dare cut. Grayson didn't move either. His fingers twitched at his side, like he wanted to step forward, to speak, to do something meaningful. But he hesitated, afraid that one wrong word might shatter the progress they'd made. And maybe, in that frozen moment, they both saw too much of themselves in the other. Two broken people trying to be whole again, afraid to ask if healing meant trusting each other, or walking away before the pain returned. When Zara finally turned, heart loud in her chest, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. And yet, she ached with the need to say something, to remind herself that this wasn't love, that it couldn't be. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the way his eyes had searched hers haunted her as she lay in bed that night, the sheets tangled like her thoughts. She didn't sleep. And neither did Grayson, who sat by the fire in his office with a tumbler of untouched scotch in his hand, staring into the flames like they held answers to questions he'd never had to ask until she entered his life. Days passed, each one folding over the last, like a page refusing to be turned. Grayson tried to return to his routines, work meetings, phone calls, deals that would make millions, but his thoughts drifted constantly to the moments that now felt more real than any of the luxury that surrounded him. He would catch himself pausing outside the nursery just to hear Zara's voice as she read bedtime stories, or walking into the kitchen only to see if she was there, humming softly while she stirred Savannah's favorite soup. Her presence had started to fill the empty corners of his world, and it terrified him. Not because he didn't want it, but because he did. More than he'd ever expected. Zara, meanwhile, stayed careful. She didn't let her guard fall, even when Grayson left flowers at her door with no note, or when he quietly replaced her worn shoes with a new pair, ones exactly her size, in the exact shade of brown she always wore. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she said nothing, because every soft gesture tugged at old wounds, at the aching memories of how easily kindness could turn into cruelty. She had almost trusted once. She would not make that mistake again so easily. But her resolve wavered the day Grayson found her in the garden, bent over the violets Savannah had planted weeks ago, her fingers trembling with cold, her eyes distant. He didn't speak at first, just watched her, something tight and silent burning in his throat. Then, with the gentleness she never expected from him, he knelt beside her, his hands outstretched, but careful not to touch. "I never knew flowers mattered to her," he said, voice low. "I didn't even notice them until now." Zara didn't look at him. "You never looked." It wasn't an accusation, just a truth, and he nodded, accepting it. "I'm trying to, now." That made her turn, slowly, and for the first time in days, she saw something raw in him. Not pity, not guilt, just honesty, vulnerability even. And that scared her more than anything, because she knew what vulnerability could become when tangled with power. It could crush you if you weren't careful. So she stood up quickly, brushing her hands clean, avoiding the look in his eyes. "You should go inside. It's cold." He did, but not before glancing back once, and she felt it, even with her back to him, the weight of his gaze lingering like a hand at her spine. That night, the storm returned. Not outside, but inside. Both of them, separately, reliving memories neither wanted to face. For Grayson, it was his father, strict, ruthless, always reminding him that power came from being untouchable. His father would never have apologized to anyone, would have mocked him for changing. But his father was dead. And Grayson was trying to live in a world that didn't need his father's legacy. For Zara, it was her mother, who once told her that kindness didn't mean weakness, that loving people who didn't love you back didn't make you foolish, it made you brave. But her mother had died crying, hands blistered from cleaning floors that never stayed clean, heart bruised from a world that never saw her worth. Zara had sworn she would never beg for someone's respect. Not like that. Not again. And yet, here she was, letting a man who once tore her dignity apart speak to her like she was worthy of softness. What kind of betrayal was it to forgive someone like him? Was it betrayal of her pain or of herself? These questions haunted her even as the days blurred into weeks, and her heart betrayed her again and again, with every accidental smile, every flutter in her stomach when he laughed too softly, when he looked at Savannah the way a father should. She didn't want to feel it, this slow melting of her armor. But she did. And when Grayson asked her one evening, very quietly, if she'd like to sit with him for dinner, not as the nanny, but as herself, she found herself nodding before she could stop. It was supposed to be simple. Just a meal. Two people trying to be civil. But the air was thick with everything unsaid, with the way his eyes kept drifting to her lips, the way her breath caught when his fingers brushed hers as he passed the wine. They talked about Savannah, then about books, then about nothing, and everything. Until Zara realized she was smiling without effort, that her guard had dropped, that she wasn't afraid, for a moment. But then Grayson said something, quiet, reverent. I think I was wrong about what beauty is. And it shattered the calm, because Zara knew what he meant. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her now, not as someone who worked for him, not even as someone he hurt, but as someone he wanted. And that was a danger neither of them were ready to face. So she stood abruptly, heart racing. I should check on Savannah. She fled the room before he could follow, and behind her Grayson sat alone, the wine untouched, the silence suddenly louder than ever. That night they didn't speak, but they both dreamed of each other. And in their dreams they said everything they were too afraid to say aloud. But reality was not a dream. And when morning came, everything was still fragile, still uncertain. Because the shadows between them hadn't gone. They had only shifted shape. And the question now wasn't whether they could love each other. It was whether they should. The morning crept in through silver-grey clouds, the sky swollen with the weight of an approaching storm, as if nature itself mirrored the brewing conflict inside the mansion's thick walls. Zara stood by the window of her small room, her eyes tracing the pale light that filtered through the mist, heart pounding with a rhythm she could neither name nor suppress. Sleep had abandoned her long before dawn, chased away by memories too fresh and feelings too complex. She replayed last night over and over, the quiet dinner, the gentleness in his voice, the dangerous softness in his gaze, and it made her chest ache with something close to fear. Not because she believed he was lying, but because she feared he wasn't. Because kindness from a man like Grayson was a thread that once tugged could unravel everything she built to protect herself. She pressed a hand to her chest, hoping it might slow the storm inside. But it didn't. Meanwhile, just floors below her, Grayson was seated at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together, staring at the floor, like it held answers to the questions tightening around his neck. He had never felt so unsure. Not in boardrooms filled with cutthroat investors, not when signing billion-dollar contracts, but now, with Zara occupying his thoughts every waking moment, with Savannah asking when Mommy Z would come eat with them again. He was drowning in uncertainty. He had hurt her, deeply, publicly. And no apology, no gesture, no quiet dinner would ever erase what he had done. And yet, every day she remained, showing up with the same grace and care and strength. She taught him something he didn't want to learn before. That love was not something you owned or deserved. It was something you earned, inch by inch, with truth, with humility, with change. Still, the shadows of who he had been clung to him like smoke. They whispered doubts, reminded him of every cruel word, every hateful thought, and part of him wondered if he deserved to want her. But when Savannah came running into his room, hair wild and face bright, clutching a crayon drawing of her, of Zara smiling beside them at a sunlit picnic, he felt a sharp stab of guilt twist deeper. "Do you think she'll be our real mummy someday?" she asked, so innocently it stole his breath. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Not because he didn't want it, but because the path there was littered with the broken pieces of their past. So he folded the drawing carefully, placed it in his desk drawer, and promised himself he'd try to deserve her. Outside, thunder rolled, and rain finally broke across the windows, like tears too long held back. It was during that storm that Zara found herself summoned, not by Grayson, but by Savannah's panicked screams echoing through the house. She rushed to the nursery, heart in her throat, to find the little girl curled on the bed, trembling, afraid of the lightning. Zara gathered her close, holding her as the thunder cracked and rumbled. "I'm here," she whispered, brushing tears from Savannah's cheeks, her voice soft and steady. "You're safe." It wasn't the first time she'd said those words to a child, but this time they felt different, like a promise she was making to herself, too. She didn't notice Grayson in the doorway, watching them, his eyes unreadable. He stepped forward, only when Savannah reached for him. He joined them on the bed, unsure, awkward, but present. The three of them sat there in silence, wrapped in a shared warmth that neither parenthood nor power could manufacture. It was real and terrifying. Zara stood eventually, needing space to breathe, to remember who she was outside of this strange tenderness growing between them. She retreated to the kitchen, where memories of that awful birthday party clung to the corners like ghosts. The place where she'd been humiliated, where his voice had broken her dignity before dozens of watching eyes. She still heard the echo of his words sometimes, in her weakest moments. "How dare you kiss my child?" And now he looked at her like she was the light in his daughter's life. The shift was dizzying, and when he found her there, later, alone, eyes closed and breath uneven, he said her name so gently it made her flinch. "Zara." She turned slowly, the way he stood in the doorway, wet from the rain, shirt sleeves rolled up, tension clinging to him. Should have reminded her of the man who hurt her. But it didn't. It reminded her of the man who'd stayed on the bed until Savannah fell asleep, who'd looked at her like she mattered. He didn't speak right away, just watched her, searching her face like a map he was trying to read for the first time. "You don't have to stay," he said finally. "Not out of duty. Not for her. Not for me." Zara's jaw clenched. "You think I don't know that?" He nodded once, slowly. "Then why do you?" She hesitated, Then quietly. Because someone has to love her the way she deserves. And right now, that someone is me. Grayson stepped closer. And what if I want to be that someone too? The room spun with the weight of that confession. Zara felt it land between them like a thunderclap. You can't just want it, she said, voice trembling. You have to prove it. Every day. Especially to her. But to me too. He nodded again, slower this time. I will. And for the first time she believed he meant it. But belief wasn't love. Not yet. And as the storm outside softened into mist, the distance between them shrank without touch, without promises, just a shared truth that they were no longer enemies. But not yet lovers. Something else entirely. Something fragile, unnamed, growing in the silence between unspoken words. The air between them hung suspended, heavy with words left unsaid and feelings too volatile to name, as the echo of Zara's last sentence lingered in Grayson's mind. You have to prove it. Every day. He heard it in his head, even as she turned from him, even as her shadow disappeared down the hall without a single glance back, and it burned into his thoughts like scripture etched in fire. That night, neither of them slept. Not from insomnia, but from the weight of every fragile boundary that had shifted between them. Grayson sat in the dim corner of his study, every lamp off, the only glow coming from the dying fire across the room, casting his chiseled face in trembling orange hues, his whiskey untouched. He stared into the flames, but all he could see was her face, the curve of her mouth when she was about to scold him, the way her eyes softened when she looked at Savannah, the storm of restraint in her expression every time their fingers accidentally brushed. It was driving him mad, this awareness of her, this clawing regret that couldn't be undone with apologies or diamonds or extravagant gestures. He had once believed love was transactional, something you could buy, win, or conquer. But with Zara, love wasn't something he could possess. It was something he had to earn, and he didn't know if he was worthy. Meanwhile, upstairs, Zara stood before her mirror, fingers gripping the edge of her dresser as she struggled to hold her breath steady. It wasn't just about what he said anymore. It was about what she saw in his eyes. He was changing, slowly, painfully. And that terrified her, because the moment she let herself believe he was different, the moment she opened the gates around her heart, she would be vulnerable again. And vulnerability had never protected her. Not in this world. Not in this skin. Her mind screamed at her to build her walls higher, but her heart, the same heart that softened when Savannah reached for her in sleep, the same heart that fluttered when Grayson said her name, wanted to believe this change was real, that he was real, and it was in that fractured place between reason and feeling that the fire began to grow. The next morning came slowly, wrapped in grey light and unspoken tension. Grayson appeared in the kitchen early, earlier than usual, wearing soft linen and no armor. Zara looked up from Savannah's breakfast, startled, lips parting in automatic protest, but he held up his hands, not in surrender, but in peace. I just want to talk, he said. No arguments, no pressure. She didn't answer, just slid Savannah's plate across the table and gently kissed the girl's forehead before turning toward the sink, giving him her back. It should have been the end of the conversation. But it wasn't. She called you Mom again in her sleep, he said quietly. She was smiling when she said it. That broke something loose inside Zara, something dangerous and warm and aching. She turned slowly, her eyes unreadable. She needs someone to love her unconditionally. He stepped closer. So do I. The words hung in the air like a confession, sharp and raw. But instead of melting, Zara stiffened. You don't get to say that, not after what you did. Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through him like glass. You said I was nothing. You humiliated me. You made me feel like my skin was a curse. He looked down, shame coursing through him. I know, and if I could take back that day, I would burn it from history. He moved closer, eyes heavy with regret. But I can't. All I can do is become a man who deserves your forgiveness. Her jaw clenched, but her eyes betrayed her. They shimmered just slightly with the weight of the war she was losing inside. Words are easy, Grayson, he nodded. Then let me prove it with silence. And for once he turned and left first, leaving her alone, heart pounding with a mixture of fury, confusion, and something dangerously close to hope. The days that followed blurred with moments like that, almosts near misses, soft glances across rooms, conversations that danced along the edges of something more. Grayson was patient for the first time in his life. He started walking Savannah to her lessons himself, learning the names of her dolls, asking about her dreams. He started showing up to dinner without a phone, without business calls. And Zara, though she said nothing, noticed every change, every soft detail, every effort. But not everyone did. Rumors began to stir among the staff. Whispers about how the nanny had bewitched the boss, how the black girl with the soft eyes had done what no heiress could. Zara heard them. She always did. But she didn't break. Not until one afternoon, when a distant relative of Grayson's, his late father's cousin, arrived uninvited. A tall, icy woman named Beatrice, with eyes like sharpened steel and a voice that could snap stone in half. She saw Zara in the hallway and didn't even try to hide her disdain. "So, this is the help," she said loudly. No wonder the child's confused. Zara stood frozen, heat flushing up her neck. But before she could respond, Grayson appeared, voice cold as winter. "Zara is not the help," he said clearly. "She is family." The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice looked at him like he had gone mad. "You would destroy your father's legacy for this." Grayson didn't blink. "My father's legacy was built on hate. It dies with me." Zara couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because suddenly the man who had once made her feel invisible was standing before the world and claiming her as his. Not a possession, not a secret, but someone worth defending. And it terrified her, because part of her wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that redemption was real, that love could rise from ashes, that forgiveness didn't make her weak. And that night, when he knocked softly on her door and asked if she would join him for tea. Not wine, not dinner, just tea under the stars on the terrace. She said yes. They sat in silence at first, the night air crisp around them, the city lights flickering in the distance like blinking eyes. Then, softly, she spoke. "What changed you?" Grayson didn't hesitate. "You did." And just like that, the fire between them no longer burned with destruction. It warmed, and for the first time, they let it. The stars shimmered above like quiet witnesses as the last steam curled from their teacups, untouched for too long, forgotten in the silence that had somehow become more intimate than words. Zara sat across from him, with her hands folded in her lap, the soft wind tangling a few strands of her hair across her face. and Grayson watched her, not with the hunger of a man used to having everything, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had finally learned what it meant to see another human being. The weight of what he had said still hung between them. "You changed me." And though Zara had not responded, the flicker in her eyes, that split-second softening of her jaw, told him she heard it, felt it, feared it. Not because it was untrue, but because it was. She leaned back slowly, spine straight as always, though her heart was rattling like a prisoner behind her ribs, and she didn't know how to name the sensation creeping into her. Was it healing? Was it hope? Was it the echo of pain, loosening its grip just enough to let something new in? She didn't speak for a long time, and neither did he. They let the silence bloom between them, thick with every word left unspoken over the last painful months, every apology unsaid, every wish swallowed, every ache buried under the sharp teeth of survival. Grayson was the first to break it, not with a declaration, not with a question, but with a story. His voice low and raw, not smooth like it usually was when talking to board members or investors, but human, like a man peeling back layers of armor he'd worn so long he forgot he bled underneath. He told her about his childhood, about the mansion that never felt like home, about a father who believed emotions were weaknesses and skin color determined worth, about the fear of failure injected into his blood from the time he could walk, about a mother who smiled only in photographs and never in real life. He told her how he was taught to win, not to connect, to possess, not to cherish, to look at people in terms of use, not soul. And as he spoke, something inside Zara shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. The painful acknowledgement that even monsters had origin stories, that hate was often inherited like wealth, and sometimes shedding it meant losing the only identity a person ever knew. "I didn't know how to be better," he admitted, voice trembling for the first time, "until you made me want to be." Zara turned her head, then, just slightly, to look at him. Really look at him. And what she saw wasn't the man who'd once screamed at her in front of a party full of people. It wasn't the arrogant billionaire who wielded power like a sword. It wasn't even Savannah's father. What she saw was a man unraveling in front of her, thread by thread, laying himself bare, not to be pitied or excused, but understood. "You made me angry," she said at last, voice hoarse. "You made me feel like I was nothing, like my skin, my voice, my love for your child were things to be ashamed of." He nodded slowly, his eyes shining. "I did, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." She exhaled a long breath, one she hadn't realized she was holding. "But," she added, and the word cracked open the air like a promise, "you didn't break me." That made him flinch, not from shame, but from awe, because she hadn't. She stood stronger than anyone he knew, and the fact that she was still here, still willing to sit with him under the stars, still willing to listen, was proof of a strength he would never possess. Not fully. "Zara," he said, and the way her name tasted in his mouth felt like prayer. "What would it take for you to ever trust me?" She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stood, slow and deliberate, walked toward him with steady feet and quiet eyes, and then, without ceremony, she sat beside him on the same bench, so close their shoulders touched. She didn't take his hand. She didn't look at him. But she didn't move away. And that, in that moment, meant more than any vow or kiss or tear-stained confession. They sat like that for a long while, the wind whispering through the trees above, the city humming below, the stars painting hope across the bruised sky. Eventually, Grayson spoke again, softer this time. "There's a gala next week," he said. "A foundation dinner, public, press family. I want to take you." Zara stiffened, the warmth she'd just allowed into her bones suddenly icing over again. "Why?" she whispered. He turned toward her, not touching, but fully present. "Because I want the world to see the woman who raised my daughter, the woman who saved me from myself. Because I'm done hiding behind excuses. Because they need to know what I know, that you are extraordinary." Her eyes filled then, unbidden, and she hated herself for it, for letting his words touch that raw, fragile place inside her, the one she had boarded up so long ago. It barely remembered what vulnerability felt like. "You don't get to parade me to clean your conscience," she said sharply. He flinched. "It's not about my conscience," he replied. "It's about respect. Yours. Mine. Ours." That word, ours, landed like thunder. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But she didn't leave either. And that was something. The days that followed were filled with strange electricity. Shared breakfasts with Savannah, quiet hallway glances, brief conversations that sparkled with new understanding. But underneath it all, there was a growing current of tension, of anticipation, of fear and hope battling for dominance. When the night of the gala arrived, Zara stood before her closet in the simple dress she'd bought long before Grayson had even asked her to attend. A black silk gown that hugged her figure like a second skin and made her feel strong, not for what it revealed, but for what it covered. She didn't dress to impress. She dressed to own the space she would step into. And when Grayson saw her descend the stairs, his breath caught, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she walked like someone who belonged. The gala was a cathedral of diamonds and judgment, and as they entered together, whispers swirled like fog. But Grayson never let go of her hand. And when the time came for him to speak at the podium, he did something no one expected. He told the truth. About the woman who raised his child. About the cruelty he had once believed. About the man he had become, because he dared to learn from the person he once looked down on. And when he said her name, not as a footnote, but as the beginning of everything that mattered, the room fell silent. Zara stood there, tears threatening, not because she needed validation, but because for the first time, someone powerful used his voice to amplify hers. And as they walked off the stage together, into the unknown, into the storm of headlines and backlash and whispered disapproval, they did so with hands locked, backs straight, and hearts wide open, not for the world, but for each other. The weeks that followed the gala felt like stepping into a new world, one not free of whispers or judgment, but softened by truth, healed by time, and lit by the slow-burning fire of something neither of them dared to name out loud. Peace. The kind born not from perfection, but from finally choosing each other after all the storms, after all the broken words, after all the tears that once stained the marble halls of Grayson's estate like forgotten ink. Zara no longer walked the corridors like a ghost, and Grayson no longer held himself with the brittle arrogance of a man guarding a crumbling empire. Now they moved together, two halves still learning how to fit, how to listen, how to forgive. It wasn't always easy. There were days when old wounds reopened, when the echoes of past insults rang too loud to ignore, when Zara questioned if healing beside the man who once hurt her could ever truly feel like freedom. But then Savannah's laugh would bounce off the walls like music, or Grayson would brush her fingers with his without saying a word, or she would catch him watching her with that quiet awe that looked nothing like pity, and everything like love. And in those moments, she knew. This was not about forgetting. It was about building something new on top of the ruins. Slowly, she allowed herself to let go, not of her boundaries, but of the constant fear that love would only ever come laced with pain. She had spent so long being strong, being composed, being invulnerable. But with Grayson, she was learning the strength of softness, the courage of staying, and Grayson, for his part, was changing in ways even he hadn't expected. He no longer flinched when confronted with his past, no longer clung to the shallow values he once worshipped, no longer recoiled at his own reflection. Instead, he leaned into discomfort, allowed himself to be reshaped by empathy, by compassion, by the love of a woman who had every right to leave, but stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she saw something in him no one else ever had. Potential. And Grayson, ruthless billionaire, master of control, man raised on cruelty and power, fell in love not like a firestorm, but like a garden blooming after a long winter. He learned to be gentle, to listen, to hold her when she wept and not demand an explanation, to celebrate her joy even when he didn't understand it. And in that he found a version of himself he never knew he needed to be. One late evening, after putting Savannah to bed, Zara stepped onto the back terrace, where Grayson was waiting with 2 cups of tea and a nervous glint in his eyes. He had been fidgeting all day, checking his pocket, clearing his throat, pacing in the quiet corners like a man with something impossible to say. And now, as she approached, her hair loose and her laughter soft from reading bedtime stories, he stood slowly, clearing his throat. "Zara," he said, and the way her name curled in the air felt like a song. "I've been trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words, but maybe love doesn't need perfection. Maybe it just needs truth." Her breath hitched. He reached into his jacket, not with the grand pomp of a showman, but with the trembling grace of a man afraid and brave all at once, and pulled out a small velvet box. "I don't just want you to stay in this house," he whispered. "I want you to make it a home with me. I don't want Savannah to just call you Mum. I want the world to know that's exactly who you are, and I want to spend every day proving I deserve you." Zara didn't speak at first. She looked at the ring. A simple band, elegant and understated, nothing like the gaudy diamonds she'd seen in tabloids. And then she looked at him. At the man who once shattered her pride, at the father who learned to be soft for his daughter, at the soul who tore down walls just to meet her halfway. And she began to cry. Not the bitter tears of humiliation from that birthday party, not the quiet weeping of isolation, but the kind of tears that tasted like rain after a drought. She nodded slowly, then stepped forward, took his face in her hands, and whispered, "Yes, yes, because you fought for this, for us, because you saw me." And when they kissed, it was not the kind of kiss that ends a fairy tale. It was the kind that begins a new life. The wedding was small, just close friends, staff who had become family, and Savannah standing proudly between them in a dress that matched Zara's. There were no reporters, no headlines, just love, quiet and real. Grayson's vows were simple. You taught me to feel, to rise, to be more. I vow to spend the rest of my life honoring that lesson. Zara's voice trembled when she spoke hers. You broke me once, but you built me better. And I choose you, not because I need saving, but because I see who you are now. And I believe in that man. As they exchanged rings, the crowd wept, not because it was a fairy tale, but because it was earned. After the ceremony, while Savannah twirled in the garden, Zara stood on the balcony, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. Grayson came up behind her, arms wrapping around her waist, forehead resting on her shoulder. You're not dreaming, he whispered, as if reading her mind. You're home. And she was. Home. Not the mansion, not the wealth, but the arms that once pushed her away, and now held her like treasure. It would never be perfect, but it would be honest, kind, true. And in the quiet of that golden evening, with laughter behind them and peace before them, they finally stepped into the life they had both been searching for. Not in spite of their pain, but because of it. Together. Forever.